Hello students, welcome back to the Analyst for 4th May 2024, where we will be discussing 9 most important articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express. We find that the very first article is regarding the paradox of India's global rise, where we will be looking into an editorial which will be discussing both the rise and the paradox of India's international relations. In the next article, we will be looking at the recent status of the Sustainable Development Goals all across the world, and we will be also looking at some of the important government initiatives taken in India. We will be looking at the Manipur controversy, which is reaching its first anniversary, in the third article. In the fourth article, we'll be looking at the recent rumors and reports regarding the capital gains tax in India. And in the fifth article, we'll be looking at a meteor shower that will be taking place recently, which is known by the name of AQUARIDS. And finally, to wrap up the session, we'll be discussing 4 more important prelims snippets, which will be discussing news in shorts for your prelims examination, which is upcoming soon. So stay tuned. So students, welcome to the very first article. In this one, we'll be talking about India's paradox when it comes to the international relations and its global rise and its neighborhood relations. And the context is that amid India's global rise, there is a clear waning of its regional influence, and this is according to this editorial, a very important piece of editorial by Happy Mon Jacob, a distinguished author and strategist in the international relations circles. Now, this is a very important article from GS2 perspective, where we have to look into the effects of various policies taken by developing and developed nations on India's interests, and also we'll be looking a little bit on the Indian diasporas. And here, now to start this, the author has discussed some of the potential areas where India has become a major economic and military and various other parameters on which India has become an absolute power source on the global arena, and that is why over the last 20 years India has been rising consistently. The first reason for the same is the economic powerhouse of India. In this, we have to understand that India is ranked third when we talk about nominal GDP at purchasing power parity, and we see that we are just behind China and US, even leaving behind the most advanced economies such as Japan, Germany and the UK. So in this one, we find that India is potentially a very large economic powerhouse and even potential sources of various markets where the foreign investors, they come into India and they invest and set up shop within the same nation. The next, we have to understand India's growing military considerations, and this is with respect to the latest SIPRI report. We find that India is just at rank 4th when we talk about the military expenditure worldwide. So India is just behind US, China and Russia, and here also India is left behind nations such as Australia, Italy, South Korea, Japan, the most advanced nations when it comes to military expenditure. So we find that with reference to military expenditure also, India is on the rise globally. Next, obviously we find that India's demography is a very, very fresh one, is a very, very young one. When we find that most of the Indian population, more than 50% of the population is within the working age, that is within the age of say 15 to 59 years of age. So we find that India is also having the most productive and employable population in the entire world. Next, we find that India's inclusion in key global groupings, be it the G20, be it India's invitee membership to the G7, be it the Quad, be it the SCO, be it BRICS, India is everywhere. So we have to understand that India's inclusion in major global indexes, in major global groupings, is also giving India a major bargaining chip at the international circles. We have to also turn our attention to the Indo-Pacific region. In this region, we have the South Asian region where we have India and India's neighbors. Also, when we look eastwards, we find Southeast Asian nations, and also we find that integration of this entire region, when we talk about trade, when we talk about military installments, defense installments, this Indo-Pacific region in recent times is a very, very major source of attention globally. And here, the presence of India on the banks of Indian Ocean, and also the presence of China on the same, is attracting global attention, especially of the Western powers. And here India is also poised for increased amount of investment in this region, and not only India's own investment, but also India's investment in the neighboring nations too. And finally, we have to also talk about strategic Indian investments abroad, particularly in Iran, particularly in various other Gulf nations, and also in various nations such as Russia and even Southeast Asian nations. We find that Indian investors are right now going to set up business in those regions. And also we find that this business to business connections from a nation to nation perspective is also propelling India to the next era of global power politics. Next, we also have to look about the Indian diaspora who are actually present in various nook and corner of the world. When we talk about the largest number of migrants, international migrants, the largest number of migrants internationally are Indians themselves. It is followed by Mexico, Russia, and so on. And the largest number of Indians are actually living in the Gulf nations, followed by the Western nations such as US, UK, Europe, and so on. So we find that in the international nations also, we have a strong force of Indians who are advocating for their own choices, demands, and also contributing a major share of employment in those nations too. On the other hand, when we talk about the global arena, India is doing perfectly fine. But when we look more closer to our neighborhood regions, we find that India is grappling with many issues. If we start discussing individually, look at some of the neighbors here, we'll be looking at India is having major issues with the major neighbors. Now, if we start with Nepal, right? The main concern with Nepal was that in 2015, Nepal changed its constitution and it became, much more closer to the monarchy that it was before. Whereas Nepal is still claiming itself to be a democratic nation, but we have had many issues in Nepal political circles too. And that is why India in 2015 and 16 condemned the changing of its constitution. And also, India have had issues with Nepal with reference to the various border regions between India and Nepal. And that is what has actually brought Nepal more closer to China, following the tensions between India and Nepal. And if we look now to Bangladesh, we have seen that India is very close to the present political dispensation in Bangladesh, right? The administration which is led by Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh is more close to India, but her rivals in Bangladesh is totally against India and they are told allegedly to be more closer to China. And here there have been many allegations of recent India out campaigns in Bangladesh too. And now if we look at other nations such as Afghanistan, we saw that in Afghanistan, the Taliban took over in 2021 after the US troops left Taliban. And here we found that this was a vacuum region with the Taliban failed, and India since then never formally supported Taliban. But there have been some back channel discussions between Indian officials and the Taliban representatives too. And this is also angering some of the local Afghan people who are against the Taliban forces. And this is what also brings some of New Delhi's concerns on the security imperatives on the particular Indian subcontinent. Now, when we turn our heads to Maldives, we find that the recent president and the recent dispensation in Maldives is against India, where their own President Mohammad Muizzu is told to be more close to China. And it has also begun more and more close contacts with countries such as Turkey and also in some cases with Pakistan to lessen its reliance on India. And when we look at now at Myanmar, we see that in 2021, when there was a military coup which was going on in Myanmar, while India did not outright condemn the coup, but we have found that this coup is more close to China and it is also strengthening relationships with China in the same. And that is why we find that if ever Myanmar is slipping out to Chinese hands, there could be a potential risk of losing the security and the various administrative controls in this particular region. And also this will have some spillover risks to India's northeast region, where we have this northeast policy or this Act-East policy internationally. Now here, that is why we find that on the global arena where India is on a rise, but on the regional arena we have a decline where we talk about the relationships with our neighborhoods, right? I did not discuss here about Pakistan because we know that Indian neighborhood policy is focused more heavily on Pakistan and China, where India is totally trying to combat each and every tactics and each and every strategies based on the India Pakistan and India Chinese international relations when we talk about India's aspirations. Now here we have to talk about those nations with whom that India is actually having an historical tie or historical economic relations and close contacts, cultural links. With them we are seeing a potential of decline here, and that is why we found that there have been major two important geopolitical and international shifts. Firstly, it is with the American or USA withdrawal from the region. Firstly, it started with the Cold War. It started after the Cold War when USA started to gradually withdraw from the region, and that also culminated in the 9/11 terrorist attack in the US, where the Twin Towers in the New York was downed by Al-Qaeda forces. And more prominently after that, while USA tried to enhance their forces in Afghanistan, but still in 2021 US forces left Afghanistan, and this was leaving a kind of a vacuum which China is right now trying to fill. And when we talk about China, we have seen over the last 10 and 20 years there has been a rise of China economically and militarily. When we talk about India, China has been in transgression with India's sovereign borders on all of the fronts on which India has borders with China. And also India has used economic weapons to fulfill its trade with India, and mostly China is also running massive amount of trade surpluses with China, leaving India in trade deficits. So on both military and economic front, in India and China, they are having some issues. And also this issue is not between India and China. China is having issues with all of the world, and also all of the world is having the same with China here. And here, when we talk about the internal issues within India, we have to talk about the domestic issues of India's own aspirations to fight the issues related to climate change, poverty, development in the same. That is why India has to divert some of the resources within the nation itself, and that is why we have to understand that because Indians need a lot of funding for their own capital expenditure, for their own government schemes, India sometimes cannot fulfill our neighborhood aspirations such as Nepal and Bangladesh and so on. And even in recent times we have seen the same for Sri Lanka. So because we have to understand these nations, they need Indian funding, and when India cannot allocate a lot of amount of funding because it has to fulfill its own domestic aspirations to combat domestic issues, this is also leading to frustrating neighbors of India. And finally, we have to understand that the various neighborhood tensions which are directly and indirectly fueled by China, this is also leading to the same that we have also discussed in the previous slide. And here we have to understand a very, very important statement by our external affairs minister here. He is telling, and mind it, it is a very, very important quote that you can use in your ACEs and even in your answers in GS2. He's telling that this is a time for us, that is Indians, to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support. So such a beautiful statement which is coming from our external affairs minister, which is totally summarizing the Indian lens of international politics, focusing on neighborhoods and the neighbors in the region. Now here we have to solve the paradox, and here the author is also giving us very important insights here. Now India's neighborhood policy must now be looking beyond Pakistan, and that is why the smaller nations, by smaller nations we mean Maldives, we mean Nepal, we need Bangladesh, we mean Myanmar. We need all these nations, we need even Afghanistan to cooperate with India's own interests, and India also to cooperate with their own interests. Now here, we must be accepting the reality first, that South Asia's smaller powers are finding China a better alternative to India. If China is supplying them with bridges, with airports, with major ports, as we have seen in the case of Sri Lanka, even if China is increasing its military expenditure in Maldives, so these countries are actually finding China a better alternative to India. So firstly, we have to address this issue. First, we have to address the reality. Next, we must be acting. Next, we must be using India's, New Delhi's own social capital with these nations. For example, we should be exploiting the Buddhist cultural heritages we are having with Myanmar, Sri Lanka. We also have to use the sentiments that we are having, historical sentiments that we are having with Bangladesh, Nepal, and also with Afghanistan. So we must be using the cultural heritage with these nations. We must be also using Indo-Pacific interests for these nations, particularly Maldives, because we have to understand Maldives is a very, very important sea route for the international trade. That is why US, India, Europe and Australia and Japan, the like-minded nations, they must be collaborating on the maritime region. They must be enhancing trade. They must be joining new minilaterals. This is minilateral, not multilateral. Minilateral means that we must be, as India, forming some formal negotiation global groupings with the neighborhood regions, such as recently we have seen the case of Colombo Security Conclave, which is actually a security kind of imperative with Sri Lanka and some other nations in the neighborhood between India. So we have to look at the security challenges within the same. Next, we have to also create new issue-based coalitions in this maritime region. And finally, we have to tap up within our own soft power. Here we have to establish informal contacts between the political and the civil societies between these nations, between the neighborhood nations and India. This can be used by the Bollywood, by cricket, by this religion, by music, this kind of soft power tactics. And finally, with reference to any conflicts which are taking place in the neighborhood region, such as in Myanmar, we have to be establishing official and unofficial conflict management processes so that the conflicts there can be resolved with India's own resources, and then the trust and credibility of India as a big brother in the region can be established and be reassured, stemming away China's interest in this region. In the next article, we'll be looking at this editorial where the author is talking about the status of this implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, where in this article we'll be using various data, and within this data we'll be showing that these Sustainable Development Goals have been greatly inadequately implemented in the rest of the world. And this is a very, very important topic for your UPSC prelims with reference to economic and social development. With reference to GS2, we have to talk about the issues related to development and management of the various social services such as health, education, human resources. We'll be touching about some important data on global important data. And finally, we have to also talk about GS3 where we have inclusive growth. And let me tell you, development is the most important aspect of inclusive growth. When we talk about inclusive growth, we talk about all sections of the population, be it the poorest sections, be it the richest sections, be it the backward sections, be it the forward sections, be it any kind of individuals who have access to resources such as the upper classes, the middle classes, the lower income classes, women, SC, STs, they all need to grow equally. So that is why we need development. And here, based on Brundtland Commission recommendations in 1980s, late 1980s, we have a definition of sustainable development. While by development we mean that we have to grow economically, but along with economics, we also have to grow in other parameters such as health, education and so on. But sustainable development takes development to the next level. Sustainable development is defined by the Brundtland Commission as development which means the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That means with development we mean that we have to grow economically, we have to grow socially also. But in the development parameters, we are focusing on the present generation. But sustainable development takes it to the next level by including the future generations also. That means here in sustainable development, we are talking about two important terms, which is intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. That means whatever the resources that the present generations are using, the same resources must be there with our own future generations. And here, the main amount of equity, the main focus of equity, while it is on the present and future generations, our environmental conservation and environmental efforts are very, very important to be taken care of. Now here, for the very first time, the sustainable development, is defined here, and you can use this definition in your answers. And in Agenda 2030, which was actually declared at the Paris Climate Deal of 2015, where some binding targets for climate change aspirations were actually fixed. In the same summit of COP, the Agenda 2020 was declared, and Agenda 2030 actually ushered in the Sustainable Development Goals that the entire world has to achieve by 2030. And let me tell you, these are the 17 goals, and within the 17 goals we have further 169 sub targets within the goals. Now the 17 goals are namely: first, no poverty, no zero hunger, then good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water sanitation, affordable clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, and so on. We can find that the list is coming to around 17 goals, and let me tell you, these 17 goals are very, very important for your UPSC, because you can use this in your conclusions, in your introductions, in your essays, wherever you find the sustainable development topic that you need to quote. So these are the various aspirations that the global community should be having, that the global governments all around the world should be implementing some national schemes and policies internationally and nationally also, so that we must be having these goals by 2030. And this was the Agenda 2030. And let me tell you, UPSC has asked this in prelims, right? And let me tell you, while the Paris Climate Deal is a binding one, but the Sustainable Development Goals that we have to achieve by 2030 is not legally binding. Now, when we come to this article, the article is advocating that there is a very, very extremely slow progress on the SDGs. And particularly when we talk about the SDG index, right? The index is actually published by the United Nations. When we look at the index here, we find that the global governments and all of the international countries here, they have taken some steps toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously. But there have been recent issues such as the COVID pandemic and the global crisis such as the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Israel-Palestine war, and the various regional wars which are taking place in Central Asia, in the various parts of Africa, and also in Latin America. These crises, these international events have slowed the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. As we can see, this dotted line is the success or say progress of SDGs without these issues. And after calculating the issues, we find that this is the gap that we have seen, that is the effect of these issues on the Sustainable Development Goals around the world. When we talk about the headcount poverty ratio in the least developing nations and the lower income countries, where the poverty line has been taken to be around $2.15 per day, we find that since 2010, while the headcount ratio has been decreasing, but we have seen that this decrease or say this decrease in this poverty level is kind of stagnant since 2019 to 2023. That means while due to the COVID pandemic, the poverty levels increased, and recently it is also declining, but since 2019-18 this has been stagnant. Also, we have been seeing a very serious amount of environmental degradation which is actually practiced by the developed Western nations on the global South nations. What happens is that the global South nations are consisting of the developing nations and the least developing nations, and here we have the nations like most of the African nations, the Latin American, even the Southeast Asian nations and South Asia also. Now here we find that these nations are actually suppliers of raw materials, agricultural crops. Here let us take the example of a t-shirt manufacturing supply chain. It starts with cotton. When we start to grow cotton, right, in the global South nations, now we understand that cotton is a very, very water intensive crop. So the nations which will be growing cotton, they will be spending all of their water resources on growing these water intensive crops. After this, a country B will be there, which will be again a developing nation, right, but more developed than country A. Now this country B will be producing the clothing, they will be setting up industries which will be polluting the air and the water in the country. But finally, the country C will be importing. These are the countries of the Western nations such as US, UK, the European nations, who will be finally importing these goods and they will be consuming themselves. But we have found that in the entire supply chain, in the entire production chain, mostly the Western nations are not producing any emissions. Now, if they are not producing any emissions, obviously in the modern times they cannot be accountable for emissions. And here we find that the global south nations, and that is why they are bearing the brunt of the global emissions, and that is why they cannot even reach the sustainable development goals because of this particular anomaly. And when we look at some other data, we find that the gap of sustainable development goals that was in 2015, that has recently narrowed down by only little. That means the success, or say the speed of this implementation of SDGs all around the world has been very, very slow. While we also try to calculate it or project it to 2030, we find that this gap will be also increasing. That means this gap of fulfilling the SDGs and not fulfilling, this will be increasing over a period of time. Now, when we talk about the overall well-being between the high-income countries and the low-income countries, we obviously find that the lower-income countries are at a lower trajectory. Also, in the recent years, their well-being has also decreased. Now, when we talk about the unemployment rate, we find that the unemployment rates are almost close between the developed and say the low-income nations. Now, here we also find that over a period of time, we find that in recent times, unemployment rate in the lower income countries, they are increasing also. And on the other hand, in the developed nations, they are decreasing in recent years. Now, when we look at the overall, the comparison here on the main parameters of SDG achievements, challenges remaining, significant challenges remaining, and the various other parameters, we find it is the lower income nations who are lagging behind the rest of the world, followed by the lower middle income countries, upper middle income countries, and the higher income countries. And also, if we can break down between the various continents, we find that it is the continents of Asia and Africa which are lagging behind here on the all 17 sustainable development goals. And also here the OECD nations are the nations who are having the most, the best SDG track records, because they are the Western developed nations, highly industrial developed nations. Now here we have to turn our attention to India on the recent government initiatives taken. Recently, India announced Panchamrit. In Panchamrit, India is trying to commit to greater environmentally and sustainably developmental goals. By 2030, India is aiming to increase non-fossil fuel capacity to 500 gigawatts. It is trying to decrease the emission intensity to GDP, or say the total emissions to GDP, by 50% by 2030. It is also trying to increase the amount of carbon sequestration, or taking the carbon dioxide from atmosphere, and reduce the carbon emissions by 1 billion tons by 2030 again. It is also trying to become net zero by 2070. Right, and here we have several other government securities to further, the various sustainable developmental goals in the country, particularly through the various themes of reducing poverty, reducing hunger, reducing fossil fuel capacities, and so on. Firstly is the National Food Security Act, where the government of India is trying to supply free food at very subsidized rates in the country. And also recently it has announced the fortification of rice, which means this rice now will be fortified and say blended with more vitamins and minerals for effective consumption by the below poverty level population. We also have a very, very important initiative for our farmers known as the minimum support price, where the government will be giving remunerative price to the farmers for their crops. Next, we also have this ethanol blending target of blending ethanol up to 20% by 2025-2026, which will be reducing the reliance of Indian imports of crude oil. Next, India is also focusing on Swachh Bharat mission, in which India is trying to drive cleanlyhood drives, and also of promoting open defecation free toilets in the country. We have the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which is trying to give bank accounts to each and every individual in the nation, hence driving financial inclusion in the nation. Indian government has also urban and rural components of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which is trying to give affordable housing to the urban and rural areas. It is also having the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao initiatives, which is trying to promote women-related developmental aspirations. And finally, it is also focusing a lot on capital expenditure in the country, where we have spent a lot of resources on building proper resources such as roads, airports, ports, and so on. And further, here, the way forward will be that according to UN SDG report of 2023, it is focusing urgent action on some key areas. Firstly, the countries must be focusing on 7 years, that is from 2023 to 2013, these 7 years. We have to be very focused on transformative actions on a national basis. And we must be having more national schemes and policies to propel SDGs forward. Next, we must be having targeted government initiatives to eradicate poverty and reduce inequality in the world. We have to also end the war on nature. Next, we have to advance the rights of women and girls. We have to also focus on strengthening the public institutions to build accelerated progress. And finally, we have to continue the strengthening of the UN developmental systems. Let these be the important points for any answers on on sustainable development goals. And also, according to UN report, future is now from 2019. We have to now manage trade-offs, such as trade-offs of environmental polluting production process and clean processes, and maximizing the core benefits of a sustainable future. So let this be the very concluding lines on which you can base your mains answers on. In the next article, we'll be looking at the completion of 1 year anniversary of this Manipur conflict, which is going on forever. And here we have to look at we have to take a look back at the background and some of the things that must be done going forward. A very, very important aspect for UPSC prelims, reference to current events of national and international importance, and also from GS2 perspective, when we're talking about linkages between development and spread of extremism in the country. Now, when we talk about Manipur conflict, we have to briefly look at the history. Now, from the ancient times, it has been told that it is the Métis of Manipur who have been the original inhabitants of the state. It has been since 33 AD when the Métis were the original inhabitants according to various historians. Now, subsequently, Métis were not alone. Métis were based on the plain regions and the lower valley regions of Manipur, as is highlighted in this region historically, while the surrounding hilly regions were originally, since ancient times, were habitated by the Nagas. Because we also understand that the state of Nagaland were also in this vicinity, and typically since history, the Nagas and the Métis, they have lived historically in a very friendly manner under the Métis royal kingdom. Now, troubles started escalating after the British came into India. Throughout the subsequent two Anglo-Burma war, we found that the British tried to bring in the Kuki population from Myanmar to act as a buffer between the local Métis and the Naga population who were agitating against the British rule in the regions. So the British brought in the Kuki peoples to placate the regional tensions in the region. And here, the tension started slowly building after India's independence, when the Kuki people who settled in these hilly regions all around the region, where we talk about their population, right now they constitute only around 28% of the population of Manipur, while they occupy around 90% of the land area. When we talk about the Métis, they hold only around 10% of the land area, but they are in majority when we talk about the populations. Also, when we talk about the Nagas and the Kukis, they are right now mostly belonging to the Christian religion, and mostly when we talk about the Métis, they belong mostly in towards the Hindu religion. But now, when we talk about the post-independent India and post-independent India in this particular political arena in this northeast region, we have to understand what happened after this. Now here, after independence, the Kuki population started demanding their own state of Kuki land, and this was on the heels of the recent, or say the then ongoing disputes of various insurgency happenings, events that were taking place in the rest of the states also. The Mizoram peoples, the Nagaland peoples, they were also demanding their own states, and hence the Kuki people also started demanding their own states. And following this, the Naga people in the state of Manipur, they also started demanding the same. And then the tension started escalating. And here we have to understand here that the Metis, while they live in the valleys, lower valleys and in the plain region, they are economically well off since the ancient and the medieval times, and even in the modern times. While they represent mostly of the people, in the Manipur government services, education, colleges, schools, and so on, they are far more economically well off than the Kuki and the Nagas, who actually live in the hilly areas. Now, the recent issue started in May 3, 2023, when Kuki and Naga peoples, they started protesting against a Métis demand of including the Métis in the scheduled tribal status list of this Manipur region. Now, these two groups, they advocated that the Métis were already economically advanced. How can they now demand ST status? And they were also non-tribal according to the Kuki and the Nagas people. And they were focusing on the developmental imbalance, because according to Nagas and Kukis, the 90% of the state government funds were actually going into the Métis infrastructural development, social development, and so on. And also, with reference to the representation in the government services, the Métis were far more higher, having more representation, right? So here the main issue is firstly on developmental side. Second issue is a migration. Second issue is from migration, is for say illegal migration which is continuing from Myanmar. Now see, in 2021 there was the military coup in Myanmar, which was also discussed in the previous topics, where the Janta, the Myanmar Janta, they started persecution of the Kuki-Shin peoples there. Now this Kuki-Shin people, they are the residents along the Myanmar-India border, and after persecution they were pushed into India, and a lot of populations were actually of the Kuki-Shin people who were resident in the hilly regions of the Manipur, where also right now Kuki and Naga peoples are living, and this enraged the Métis individuals there. And also here on this ongoing Manipur conflict, the main region, reason for this recent flare is the illegal migration of these people. The Métis, they have accused of these Kuki-Shin individuals of, narco-terror network that is, say, perpetrating from the Myanmar borders, where they are accused of collaborating with various local illegal insurgency outfits such as UNLF, PLA, and so on, right, in various camps at Saigang, Kashin, Shin regions, which they are actually accused of giving shelter to various insurgent groups, arms, ammunition supply, trained cadres, and also smuggling drugs and selling weapons. So the Métis have accused themselves of this, and the Kukis have blamed the Métis of using this illegal migration context as a pretext for ethnic cleansing. The issue is so serious in this region still now that even small kids in the schools, they are painting this landscape, and if you can look at this particular landscape here, we will be seeing that this is a scene which is depicting war in this beautiful surrounding region of Manipur, where there are various armed people leading armed struggle around the rest of the people here. So this is the condition where the school kids, they are even painting this kind of paintings in their schools. And here, the way forward, before discussing the way forward, we have to understand that at least 221 locals have been killed, along with 12 more security forces, hundreds, thousands have been injured, and 50,000 have been internally displaced. And here, 46 people are missing from both Métis and the Kukis. And that is why there have been calls for from various sections of the population in the recent times. As of yesterday, there were many groups from both the Métis and the Kuki side in Delhi, in New Delhi, where they are calling for permanent peace to this particular region. And here, we must be also evaluating the various criteria to be given to the status of ST to the Métis, particularly looking at various important committees in the past, at the local committee, Bhuria committee, and the Zaza committee recommendations, where all of the committees more or less have suggested that any population to be granted ST status, they must be properly having scrutinied the livelihood, employment of the people, education, health, involuntary displacement and migration, and the legal and constitutional matters. So here, detailed deliberations must be taken before giving SC status to the Métis on this particular grounds. Right now, the Home Minister of our country is also considering fencing the entire border of Myanmar and ending the free movement regime, which means earlier the Myanmar and the Indians were having this freedom of moving freely between the borders of these two regions. But since this is one of the reasons behind this conflict, there have been various recommendations of sealing the border and having fences between the same. Then we must be having peace agreements between the warring groups, the conflict groups in the same, between the government, between the state government and the various groups. And finally, the government of India must also be considering not extending the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in the region any further. Last, it has been extended in September 2023 for up to a period of 6 months. So after the expiration of the 6 months, the government should be considering not extending this, because in this one, the Indian security forces have been alleged of using many brutalities against the local people. In the next one, we will be looking at capital gains tax, because recently the domestic markets of Sensex and Nifty, they have plunged. The trading volumes have decreased because there have been apprehensions of a potential increase in the capital gains tax recently. Very, very important topic for your APSC prelims and in GS3, where we have government budgeting and economics. Now, when we talk about capital gains, we have to understand assets. Now see, look at this Mona Lisa painting. If you own that Mona Lisa painting, obviously you would be a very wealthy individual. And if you understand, the demand for Mona Lisa painting will be huge. So anyone can come to you and tell that, for example, if you have bought this painting for 100 crores, another business people will be coming to you and telling that I have 200 crores, you give the painting to me. So if you have bought this painting at 100 crores and now you are selling it at 200 crores, now this is something profit that you are having in between. Similarly, when you are buying a luxurious penthouse or any kind of land or property, so when you are buying it, and the difference when you are selling it, the profit, right, the profit between it, that on that particular profit, tax is levied by the government. That means whenever you are having a gain on your capital assets, there will be a tax applied by the government, and this is because your property, your painting, your asset has appreciated in value. On the basis of Indian taxation system, there are two types of capital gains: short-term capital gains and long-term capital gains. There are various assets, right, and different assets have different classifications of short-term and long-term capital gains. The features is that the rates vary on types of different assets, right, and even the holding period, or say the 1 year or 2 year or 3 year, the periods on which your short-term and long-term capital gains will be applied is also different. And also for cryptocurrencies, we have a 30% capital gains tax, which is also known as virtual digital assets tax. Now the rumors in the report is that the government will be bringing in standardization in the capital gains tax. As I have told you before, that there are two types, short-term and long-term, as we can see across various assets such as equity or stocks, mutual funds, non-mutual funds, non-equity, real estate, some listed bonds. They are having different amount of characterizations on different amount of capital gains. So there is some complexity. There is some complexity on the calculation of the capital gain tax, and also on the basis of indexation. Indexation in capital gains tax means that you are adjusting the profits with reference to the inflation which has taken place in the economy. So when we are adjusting, you are indexing the taxes also. So this is a very complex system which is taking place right now. And in the report also told that there will be some standardization. But the Finance Minister of India has rejected any of the rumors. And also, it is told by various experts that India will be addressing this tax-based erosion, where there are many investors who are looking at some nations who are having very low capital gains tax, such as Maldives, such as Netherlands, the small island countries who are giving effective tax rates of only 2%, 5%, and so on. But if you look at India, you have 10%, 15%, 20%. So obviously those individuals will be basing their companies' businesses in those islands, and if they're basing, if Indian companies, foreign companies are basing their business on those low tax countries, Indian taxation authorities, India as a whole, they will be losing tax revenues, right? We will be losing tax revenues, and that is why we have to understand that we must be addressing this capital gains taxes norms also. And that is why, you know, we have this clamor with this call for global minimum corporate tax by OECD, where we have two pillars. Pillar one is telling that every company, they must be having some of the profits that they are gaining in some companies in the countries in that particular, you know, regional nation only. For example, if Google is having some profits in India, that means that profits must be invested, a certain percentage of the profits must be invested in India itself. It should not be taken wholly to USA. Next, pillar 2 tells that there must be a global minimum tax of 15% internationally, so that any small countries which are levying a small amount of taxes, they can be warded off. So these are the various rumors and the various amount of apprehensions which have been appearing. That is why the stock markets have crashed recently. But here the finance minister reassured that there is no issue of standardization as of now. In the next one, we will be talking about AQUARIDS, a meteor shower which is projected to happen in in our world from 5th May to 6th May, and mostly the southern hemisphere will be prominently viewing this meteor. And here, a very important article from General Science and GS3, awareness in the fields of space. Now, when we are talking about meteor showers, firstly we have to understand what are comets. Now, see, comets are icy, icy bodies which revolve around the solar system. And here, these are frozen leftovers from the formation of the solar system. Now, these frozen leftovers have moved beyond the planets of Neptune, and they are bordering around the region of Neptune and Pluto, and also the region beyond them, right? Then actually they are present in this Kuiper belt and this Oort cloud, right, where we have lots and millions and billions of comets. These are the icy remains of this solar system, and they are composed of this nucleus which is having this small mass of rock which is frozen, and here they have this iron tail, and when they come very close to sun, they have these gases within these comets which actually emits light. So whenever comets come in contact with the sun, they release this amount of glazing bright trails. This is the dust trail. And we have to understand how exactly comets are linked to meteor showers. Now we have to understand meteors are actually any extraterrestrial material, be it rock, dust, anything that is entering the Earth's atmosphere and is immediately burning up due to the friction between the atmospheric layers. Meteors are very different from asteroids, which are rocky smaller bodies, right, which is orbiting the sun, right? They are present between Mars and Jupiter. Also, it is different from meteoroids, which are rocky or metallic fragment of an asteroid itself, right? It is also different from meteorite, which is meteor fragment that reaches finally the ground. So we have to be very cautious about the various differences, right? Now, this particular Eta Aquarids, this is actually found when Earth passes through orbital plane of the Halley's comet. Now, when this Halley's comet passes, we find this beautiful amount of meteor showers that we can see here. Apart from this Eta Aquarids, we also find Orione's meteor shower associated with Halley's comets also. And here we have 30 to 40 Eta meteor shower that can happen between a very small period of time, and that is what makes this meteor shower very unique, because this is very fast, and the average speed of the shower is 66 km per second, or around 2.37 lakh km per hour. So we can only imagine how fast it is. And here right now it will be visible to southern hemisphere countries such as Indonesia and Australia, and under dark sky conditions, right, even they can be visible up to the dawn and the dusk even. Now finally we'll be discussing 4 important prelim snippets. First we'll be talking about oxytocin. Oxytocin is known as a happy chemical. This is actually one of the 4 chemicals which make you happy, apart from serotonin, dopamine, endorphin, right? And here, this is actually an hormone which is secreted by the pituitary gland. It plays a very important role in reproduction, childbirth, and even lactation in mothers. It is used for both animals and humans to accelerate normal labor for giving childbirth. It is also supposed to act directly on the uterus to create rhythmic contractions while giving birth. And also in certain animals, in particularly farm animals, it is also used to achieve milk laid down for greater milk production. And also it is believed to stimulate the mammary gland to produce milk in the animals. In the next one, we'll be looking at Lookout Circular. Lookout Circular is actually issued by police authorities, by various investigative authorities, when a criminal is absconding or intentionally missing or wanted by law enforcement agencies and they want to leave the country. So it is actually a step to prevent the criminals to leave the country, and the police can approach a court asking for the restriction. And the people who can issue the LOC, right, it can be the authorized officers, including an officer not below the rank of deputy secretary, district magistrates, superintendents of police, and the heads of the public sector banks if it is a case of a financial fraud, right? Now, LOC or lookout circulars can be modified, deleted, withdrawn by the Bureau of Immigration, and also this can be on the specific request of the authorized originators, or these people can only withdraw, modify, delete, or any kind of things can be done, right? Only on the request. Now, does an LOC lead to an arrest? It can be on the circumstances. Firstly, LOC can be to merely stop the individual from traveling outside or stop an individual from entering India. And in some cases, LOC can have a list or performa where there can be a request to detain the individual. Finally, it will be leading to the arrest by the investigating authority. In the next article, we'll be looking at World Press Freedom Index. This is released by the Reporters Without Borders, and in French it is Reporters Sans Frontières. And here, this is an annual index of freedom of speech and expression enjoyed by the journalists in around 180 nations. They look at various categories, and here these are the 5 categories of political context, legal framework, economic context, socio-cultural context, and the security context. And here the countries will be ranked on the performance on this context here. India's rank improved from 161 in last year to 159 in this year. And here the highest countries which are ranked are Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And the lowest ranking nations are Afghanistan, Syria, and Eritrea. Finally, we'll be wrapping up the discussion with shrinkflation, a very, very interesting phenomenon, where we see the packet of chips, the packet of ice creams, they're decreasing over a period of time. Their quantity of say chips and ice cream is decreasing over a period of time, but they still cost the same, right? They still cost the same before, say, 1 year, 2 year, and till now also. This is a condition when the quantity of the material, they go down, but the price still stays the same. That means you are getting in money terms less quantity than before. And this is the case of shrinkflation, which is a practice where the companies reduce the size or quantity of a product, keeping the price the same. The causes of shrinkflation, first be, it can be due to rising costs of the, say, particular business house. For example, the package of particular Lay's chips in 2000, right? In 2000, it used to cost 10 rupees. In 2024, it is still costing 10 rupees. But in between, obviously the cost of the company, they have increased. That is why there can be decrease in the quantity and the size, but not the quality. The quality still remains the same, right? The quality will be still remaining the same. Now, if the quality is decreasing, we will be knowing it as skimpflation, right? Next, it can be also due to the competition of the firms also. And the impact will be, obviously, the consumers will be reducing the value because they are getting less value for the money, and there will be difficulty is measuring inflation, because if we measure inflation, we have to talk about the rise in prices. But if you look at here, the prices are not rising, but the values are actually falling down. So it will be also very difficult for the government to measure inflation in real time. So this was all for today. I thank you all for being a very, very patient audience. Please do attend the quiz which is following up right now. All the best for your future endeavors till we meet again. Thank you.